Very sorry. Change. A little bit out. Richard, are you ready? Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first Angevin talk of the Michaelmas term. We are delighted to host you all in this historic and beautiful long gallery in the President's Lodge at Queen's. I would also like to extend a special welcome to all of Queen's Fellows, Queen's alumni, special guests from London, from Oxford University, the other place, and the USA, and fellows and guests from other colleges who are joining us this evening. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to congratulate Sir Demis Hassabis, who a few days ago received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry, a graduate of Queen's. We are all so proud of Demis for earning his Nobel, that he graduated from Queen's and has contributed so much to our college and to humanity in general. Along with his colleague John Jumper, they received the Nobel in their work on predicting protein structures from AI, using AI. This achievement has the potential to transform fields such as medicine and biotech technology. This is not just about what Demis has achieved, but also how. As one of our fellows told me yesterday, the technology Demis helped create is available for researchers at absolutely no cost, allowing them to do amazing things. We have to thank also our life fellow, Dr. Robin Walker, for very early recognizing Demis's potential and admitting him into Queen's. So please join us for a round of applause for Demis. Our very special guest tonight is Dr. Tai-Heng Cheng. Tai is the co-leader of Sidley's Global Arbitration, Trade and Advocacy Practice. He is also the co-managing partner of the firm's Singapore office, a US trial lawyer, international arbitration practitioner, and legal advisor to C-suites, boards, and governments. Tai has the rare distinction of being recognized on multiple continents as a preeminent disputes lawyer. In 2023, he received the highest award in the US for international arbitration, Law 360's MVP. He was concurrently elected by Asia Legal Business as a finalist for Disputes Lawyer of the Year in the region and identified by the Legal 500 as a leading lawyer in Latin America. Who's Who Legal recognizes Tai as a US thought leader. Virtually unique in chambers, Tai is recognized in all three categories for international arbitration, counsel, arbitrator, and enforcement. Tai was born in Singapore, and he's now a naturalized US citizen, fluent in both English and Mandarin. He has a JSD and LLM degree from Yale Law School, a BA First Class Honors in Law, and MA degree from the other place, and a graduate diploma in Singapore law. Tai is a trustee of the Frick Museum, board member of the Smithsonian Institute, the National Museum of Asian Art, chair of the Board of American Friends of St. James's Church in Piccadilly, and a trustee of the Cheng Institute for Global Affairs, among many of his civic engagements. Tai, a very warm welcome to Queen's and to Cambridge.
Thank you, Anna. It's been a lifelong goal of mine ever since I attended the other place. That one day, if I was lucky, I'd be invited to give a fireside chat in the grand environment of a president's lodgings. And so thank you so much, Anna, for extending that invitation to me. And of course, to all of you who have come. I know that your time is precious, and especially those of you who have traveled great distances. Richard, I have to confess I'm a little intimidated about speaking in your presence. The leading lawyer in private international law. I shall try to not make too many mistakes that you feel compelled to point out.
International law, as Brearley said in the fifth edition of the Law of Nations, is neither a myth on the one hand nor a panacea. It's an institution for the building of a better international order. These words have special meaning of why we are gathered here today. Tai, in your recent book, Investor-State Arbitration, in a Changing World Order, you examine the sustained worldwide challenges to investor-state arbitration arising from across the political spectrum. Can you please give us a brief overview of the work in your book?
Well, because I understand this audience comprises lawyers and non-lawyers, everyone expert and brilliant, but not necessarily the same technical background as me. Let me set the stage. Investor-state arbitration is a form of dispute resolution where a foreign investor going into a country makes an investment. The country takes certain measures that destroys or damages the investment. And by treaty, the foreign investor then has an opportunity to bring a case before an international tribunal, such as before the World Bank, for adjudication and the award of damages, typically, if there is a loss. This is a signal achievement in international law because for thousands of years, only states, nation states, had standing in international law. And now we've given private rights, rights to private corporations. Alongside that, by the way, rights to humans, which is another new field of international law. Prior to that time, disputes were sorted out through gunboat diplomacy. So if you were a US corporation and you invested in a country overseas and they seized your factory or seized your mine when they realized the mine had a lot more resources than you thought, you would call the State Department and you would call Commerce in the United States and say, we need your help. Or if in the UK, you'd call the Court of St. James and the Foreign Secretary might intervene with his counterpart diplomatically. And if it was serious enough, as in the case of the United States sometimes, we send gunboats. That obviously is not conducive to peace. I suggest to you that however imperfect a system of dispute resolution is, it is preferable to gunboats. So why then do we have this backlash? Having laid out my case to you with such obvious utility, what's happened? Well, investor-state arbitration began really through a web of treaties that began in the 1950s, post-World War II, where capital was being exported from the north, basically Europe and North America, to the south. And the OECD countries representing their corporations thought, well, we better give some strong protections to our corporations when they go to faraway places. And that worked well for a good number of decades, but the world has changed. Capital flows are no longer just north to south. They're flowing from the south to the north. China is investing heavily around the world, and they've become regional. Well, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. And all of a sudden, it's not just Argentina that's been sued. Spain was sued for over 30 cases concerning its efforts to move towards renewable energy, which therefore damaged all the foreign investors who had old energy projects. And it's not surprising, therefore, that there's now been an uproar about these private tribunals done in secret, adjudicating the rights of nations, affecting millions of citizens, and sometimes awarding damages far in excess of the national GDP. What my book, and so in response, the arbitration community for maybe 5-10 years now has really tried to improve the system. They've talked about more transparency, maybe having a standing panel of arbitrators. They've talked about greater efficiency, lower costs, a whole bunch of things. My book suggests that that's not going to solve the problem, because this is not a backlash against dispute resolution. No one could possibly say that gunboat diplomacy is preferable to a flawed system of dispute resolution. What it is a backlash to is the populist movements all across the world. In America, we've seen that. We're about to see how strong that movement is in just a few weeks, where people who very naturally, growing up, assumed their lives would always be better than their parents. Think about it. It's actually counterintuitive. Why should our lives be better than our parents? And yet we all assume that. But they haven't found that to be the case. And they found a combination of liberal democracy within their country and a global liberal trade system has created wealth but unequally distributed it. And social media and the 24-hour news cycle and the insecurities of people have caused them to plaster their wonderful aspirational lives all over and increased this resentment. In fact, the Gini coefficient in America today is less than during the Gilded Age. Thank God Henry Clay Frick did not have Instagram.
Absolutely. But Tai, would you say that investor-state arbitration is becoming anti-investor? So I have personally been on the receiving end of two negative decisions.
Yes. I didn't write them.
For 10 years of work, lots of two very sort of high-profile law firms, lots of evidence, lots of hours, and there was nothing. So what do you think?
Well, first of all, I'm sorry for your loss. I'm available for hire next time. So there has been, I perceive, a scaling back of damages quantum, which I'll get to in some detail. There's also been an increased willingness to find corruption, which gets rid of the whole thing. Although it's a complex issue because for every bribe, someone has to give it, but someone has to take it. And they are opposite sides of the V. Why do we blame only one side? And most recently, in a case concerning Latin America, for the first time ever, they invoked the national security defense. The tribunal did, saying what the country did in its own assessment was necessary for national security, and therefore it gets a free pass.
Right, interesting.
All of that creates an impression that it is anti-investor. I guess I would say it is less pro-investor than before.
Right. No, I would agree with that.
But returning to my earlier point, what's going on here? If you look at the statements of Elizabeth Warren and AOC, Alexander Cortez, our congresswoman from New York, when they were debating the new NAFTA, their comments were not directed at the procedural imperfections of dispute resolution or the treaty system. They were directed at, are we protecting the rights of our laborers in America enough? Are we protecting the industries that have strong unions, the auto industries? So the criticism directed against investor-state arbitration is misplaced, and the response is mistargeted. And so, but the thing is, arbitrators are limited in what they can do. Somewhat like judges, they are authorized and required to apply the law, the treaties, to the facts according to the evidence. They're not allowed to issue Solomonic decisions or rewrite treaties. There is a different process for that. I would suggest that to really fix this, we need to look at the substantive provisions of the treaties and for states to consider whether there needs to be a different kind of balancing. And more than that, countries have to figure out how to bring along their middle class so that people feel that the existing trade system benefits them as much as anyone else, and they are invested in that system. Okay. Only then will the ancillary mechanism of dispute resolution appended to the existing trade system be able to finally shed its status as being a whipping boy.
Tai, before we get too deep into international arbitration, tell us about your journey from Singapore to England to the United States.
Well, it was long. So I was born in Singapore, went to school in Singapore, did my military service, I'm proud to say. And well, I suppose enough time has passed that I can say this. One day I woke up and decided, wouldn't it be nice to go to Oxford or Cambridge? And so I applied. The problem is, I applied 3 months before Michaelmas term was to have begun.
Wow.
And Cambridge, in its wisdom, rejected me, and Oxford accepted me. So that after Oxford, I wasn't well. So I actually was a mini pupil to Sherry Booth at the time, and was so impressed by her in the House of Lords. I accompanied her, and she was these imposing law lords and booming voices, and there she is, this diminutive, very attractive lady with a attractive voice, but through her sheer intellect, demolished the other side. And I thought, that's what I'd like to do. But then I graduated and realized I'm not yet ready. I wasn't yet ready to pound the pavement. So I applied to LLMs in America. And enough time has passed that I can also say this. I applied to the top 5 schools: Harvard, Yale, Stanford, NYU, Columbia, I think. 4 rejected me. Yale accepted me, the top school. So off I went to Yale. And after that, there was a choice between working as a corporate lawyer on Wall Street or handling traffic accident cases in London. And so the London barrister route had forever left me by that point.
So you do a lot of pro bono work. I know that from knowing you very well. Can you share a little of that with us, whatever you're comfortable with? For example, you were helping Kosovo with their independence. You were changing police use of force as they are in protest under Black Lives Matter. Whatever you would like to share would be
so. Lawyers have a terrible reputation for being rapacious. I suggest we are tarred by some lawyers who are, but not all of us are. And many of us actually view it as a calling and a special skill that we use to give back. A friend of mine who runs a charity once said to me, Tai, if you're really committed to helping us, stop painting our walls. That's not the highest and best use of your talents. Use your legal skills. And she said, if you're just painting walls, you're making yourself feel good about yourself. If you're using your legal skills, then you're actually making the biggest impact that you can. And my firm, Sidley Austin, has a long tradition of commitment to public service. We spent something like 300,000 hours of pro bono work last year, and it's typically around that amount. It's not a secret. Law firm billing rates are in the 4 digits. Do the math. It's a lot of revenue that we've left on the table to do good. And so the cases that you mentioned, I suppose the one that meant the most to me, well, there's another one, but that one meant a lot to me because it happened during the BLM protests. And journalists in America were getting shot and blinded by rubber bullets by the riot police. And I felt compelled to do something. So I called out my friend John Avalon at CNN, and I said, John, do you know any journalist who's been shot and blinded that I can help? And he said, actually, yes. Her name is Linda Serrato. She was shot last night.
Right.
Here's the number, call her. So I did. And I said, Linda, how are you doing? And she said, well, I'm driving home, so I'm fine. I'm like, after losing an eye and having an operation, she said, yes, it's no trouble really. The only annoying thing is now when I pour myself a whiskey, I spill it all over the counter. And at that point, I thought, okay, I'm representing you.
Yeah,
tell the
great.
ACLU that they don't need to do it. I'll do it for free. And how we changed the policing practices far more quickly than just if we had gone through the lawsuit is this. I said to her the next day, I'm going to ask you to do something that's very, very cruel to you, and forgive me. I need you to go to your camera and look at the last 5 photographs you took before you were shot. True, and as I expected, riot police in a line, pointing their guns at her, loading their guns, and that's the last picture. And the police all have badges, by the way, right. So it's actually identifiable. So I thought, well, that's no good putting it in court. It'll take too long. So I called up Brian Salter at CNN, who does a Sunday morning show, and I said, tell you what, if you run this article, I'll give you the exclusive. You can break the news. So he did. That afternoon, I'm told the Minneapolis Police Department had frenetic emails flying around the police officers saying, check those images, make sure it's not your tag. And then the next day, they retracted their denial to the New York Times. Frances Robles, the New York Times reporter, was furious, of course, that they had lied to her. And so she published that on the news feed of the New York Times website so everyone could see it. And that put quite a lot of pressure on the police department to take this seriously. And we survived the motion to dismiss. It's hard to establish a civil rights claim in America. You have to show a pattern of repeated conduct over a period of time.
Right.
Whereas here we're talking about 3 or 4 days of riots. But I persuaded the chief judge that 7 incidences in 7 nights is a pattern of repeated conduct in these circumstances, and we survived. So we settled it. And I said to Linda, please let me go to trial. I'll give you so much more money. And she said, no, I want to get on with my life. As a journalist, I cannot be in a lawsuit and have my notes be subject to discovery. So we settled it for some that she wanted. But in addition, she insisted, and we got it, a change in the policing practices on the use of lethal rubber bullets. And that, I think, was what she wanted the most. Postscript. I always had a feeling that that was not the only reason why she wanted to settle it. Turns out the bullet, she won't mind me saying this, the bullet caused brain damage. Oh. And she's now progressively losing her languages. And she wants to finish her next autobiography before that happens. She's well along. She called me up the other day and said, Tai, I have a description of you. Can I run it by you? I said, all right, oh dear. And it said, Tai is the most mercenary lawyer you will ever meet with the kindest heart.
Tai, are we back to the first half of the 20th century in time? A time that was marked by so many significant global events, major wars. We have a crisis today. Where does this leave international law as we know it? And where are we going?
There are, international, as it has developed, covers a vast field of different subject matters. But the single most important thing that emerged out of public international law after 1945 was a system of rules and regimes and norms and institutions that have prevented us from getting into another world war for well over half a century. And in my view, there are 3 key struts to this current world order that we have that has worked so well so far. First, nations cannot use force against someone else, another nation, except in self-defense or with Chapter 7 authorization from the UN Security Council. Pretty good principle. I mean, for those of you who are not lawyers, forget the legal impact of it. As a general principle, it's a good idea not to hit someone else unless you're doing self-defense or your schoolmaster says you can do it. The second principle is international humanitarian law. When you go to war, you still have to give a care about the civilians of the other side who are not at war with you. So you don't indiscriminately bomb hospitals. You don't take measures without sufficient precautions to avoid collateral damage to civilians. Certain types of munitions, like claymore mines, are banned because they're highly random and destructive. And the third strut is even with regards to enemy combatants, they are entitled to certain basic rights and treatments that comes along with human dignity that we all have. So we don't torture enemy combatants. We don't gratuitously harm them. And the list is long.
Right, but currently we've got problems that are arising in real time.
Yes.
Right? There's no army to enforce it, and there's no means of enforcement at all. So, case in point Gaza, case in point Ukraine, Russia, where are we?
So, starting with Ukraine, entirely pretextual to invade Ukraine. It wasn't self-defense. It wasn't authorized by Chapter 7 of the Security Council resolution. It's knocked out the first of the 3 legs that have held our world in relative peace. Arguably, the way in which it has been fought by both sides in certain of the tactics and some of their equipment has violated the other two struts, protecting civilians and treating enemy combatants in a way that's not unduly cruel. Gaza has done the same thing. Now, Gaza, arguably, well, it's clearly in self-defense, not arguably, it's clearly in self-defense. But the scale of the response
Right.
and the length of the response and the method of the response, many would say, and the International Court of Justice has pronounced, violates the other two limbs that we're talking about. And so again, just take out the law hat for a minute and just think, if we want a world that's safe, we want to not fight with each other, and when we fight, we have to fight fair, and we don't want to fight with, and we don't want to drag into it innocent people on the playground. All three of those principles are now infringed upon. And the problem with infringing upon a principle like that is that other states later come along and say, well, you did it first, we can do it too. In fact, Russia used the United States and UK's bombing of Kosovo, Serbia, for humanitarian grounds, not in self-defense, without Chapter 7 authorization, as the precedent for what it did in terms of it claimed humanitarian protection of Russians in Ukrainian territory. So first thing we need to do is be careful about creating exceptions for special situations, because one day your ox can be God too. I'm certain that the outcomes in Ukraine and Gaza will be a function of power, military power, economic power, diplomatic power. But that does not restore the international legal order. What needs to happen is that the exercise of power needs to be accompanied by normative force, by joint common statements and consensus of nations and people as to what the appropriate standards of conduct are, to reaffirm the three struts that I described to you. That is happening. The International Court of Justice, in a remarkable decision, which I think was all but 2 votes, which is in the ICJ as close to unanimous as you could get, found the occupation of Gaza to be illegal. We can debate whether they went too far or not, but there are efforts by authoritative bodies to reassert principles that have existed. The International Criminal Court has brought indictments. Again, you could argue whether it's political and it's appropriate, but it's an effort to reassert the system as it is. And we need more of that. When Gaza happened, I lobbied some nation states, and I said to the governments, it's too controversial now to sign a resolution that's either pro-Palestinian or pro-Israeli, but surely you can sign UN General Assembly resolutions or put forward resolutions that protect humanitarian aid to civilians. That is something on which we can all agree. And so they did. I don't think they did it because I told them to do so, but they did it, and I'm happy that they did. And so these efforts cumulatively, I think, will restore our order. But we also have an opportunity here, which is to modify the rules in a way that keeps pace with the nature of warfare today and geopolitics. But at the baseline, the core principles have to be reestablished.
But how do you, I mean, these states are all acting with impunity. There's no enforcement mechanism. So where does this leave the International Court, the UN, the General Assembly? Essentially, there is no enforcement mechanism, and therefore this is where we find ourselves.
Powerful states acting with
Right.
impunity.
Right.
Microstates don't.
Right.
And so the legal system is not perfect, as you said. It's more than a myth, but less than perfect. And there is no silver bullet. From my particular school of international law, by the way, I shed all my analytic jurisprudence from Oxford. Eventually, I went to Yale, and I thought, and now I think of law now as process. International, in particular, is a process. There is never a permanent state of equilibrium, and there are norms, and people react to them, and then there are responses. And in that process, we try and keep things within an optimal band of policy outcomes. That's where we are. We have efforts. They are not perfect. They're not silver bullets. And cumulatively, I can only hope that we will restore some semblance of order that continues to keep us out of a world war for the next 50 years.
Do you think we'll ever come up with an exception to state immunity as we know it?
Well, we already have exceptions to state immunity. Typically, when a state...
Enforceable.
And enforceable. Oh, I have a chamber's ranking for importance.
Okay.
So state immunity is actually a domestic legal concept, which says in a domestic system like the UK courts, you can't sue a foreign state because we don't want the UK to be sued elsewhere. So there's a sense of reciprocity and comedy. There are exceptions, and they vary from country to country in different legal systems. By and large, they include things such as if a state engages in commerce, then it's no longer acting as a state, but as a private actor, and immunity does not attach. So you can sue the state.
Right.
And then if you win, you can seize their assets. It's really fun, actually, seizing assets of states. The problem is, I think what you're thinking of is state immunity for official government acts.
Correct.
Because acts of war are acts of government.
Right, absolutely.
And that falls squarely within the idea of sovereign power and authority.
Right.
And the US Supreme Court has recently made that very clear, at least as a matter of US law. Right. I don't think that decision is terrible, by the way, that a elected leader should be able to make decisions in good faith without fear of political recrimination through litigation later on.
You're talking about Trump.
In general. Yeah, Trump in particular, but also but more
right.
than Trump.
Right,
we can't make law for just Trump, although I wish we could.
No, in the context.
Yes. But what needs to happen is there needs to be another mechanism then to check an elected representative leader against his bad faith or corruption or ignorance or stupidity or whatever. And that's the impeachment process by the other branch of government, the legislature. Or by cabinet. The cabinet can actually remove him. It's just those mechanisms don't seem to be functioning so well right now.
Right.
But I think the fix is to fix those mechanisms, not to remove immunity for government actions.
On a lighter note, AI and the law.
Yes.
What changes do you think the legal profession will go through as we cycle through artificial intelligence and its impact?
Are you sure it's a lighter note? I think we're all going to lose our jobs.
Yeah.
So I recently wrote a award against the Investor State Award against quite a significant country. And because I had some concerns about confidentiality, I thought, well, if they're gonna hack my computers and read one award, why don't I write an award with the opposite result? But I certainly wasn't going to spend the time to do it, so I asked ChatGPT to do it for me. The introduction came back in first draft, riddled with fundamental errors, like a first-year associate's memo. So I told ChatGPT what they did wrong. The second draft came back really quite good, one or two minor things, like a second-year associate's memo. Mm-hmm. And I gave ChatGPT some pointers, and the third draft came back, and it really was quite good. And so this is just an illustration that I think AI is going to get to the point where it entirely replaces junior lawyer functions because those are largely technical in nature and labor intensive. AI is essentially just big data and computing speed. And if the skills required are rudimentary, then a computer can do them more efficiently and more cheaply. What that means is that we'll need far fewer lawyers in America. I don't feel entitled to comment about England, but in America, we'll need far fewer lawyers, which means there should be far fewer law schools. There are currently about 300 law schools in America. And then I asked myself, well, why then do people hire me? And on a good day, I tell myself it's because I have better ideas than them and they want my ideas. And on a bad day, I tell myself, come on, there's no way a CEO thinks you're smarter than them. They want your networks because you can make things happen because you have different networks than they do. Well, if that is the value that people are willing to pay for among senior lawyers, then we have to figure out a way to get law students to that point without going through the current process of being a junior lawyer as much. And I think that model is essentially the Oxbridge tutorial model. Because you have smaller ratios, you have a mentorship. if there's a chemistry between the professor and the student. And sometimes it can be lifelong. You are taught to articulate your thoughts with clarity, to challenge your ideas, and you're networked with other people who are, in all likelihood, likely to go on to become very, very successful and part of your extended network through which you can exercise some influence.
So recently, Forbes in the US wrote an article on you a couple of weeks ago.
Yes.
How do you think they portrayed you?
I actually really, first of all, it was too flattering and too kind. But and a bit embarrassing, therefore. But I thought the reporter was the best sort of journalist because she saw insights about me that I didn't even know. But having seen it, wrote it in such a self-evident way that it seems so obvious. How could I not have known that? And one thing I've been struggling with is, I do things, a friend of mine said this, there are things we do to make a living, and then there are things we do because we make a living. And I was struggling to find a common thread between the things I do to make a living and the things I do because I make a living. And Alexander Bragman, his name is the lawyer, reporter, found it. She saw that there was a common thread of me being motivated by wanting to leave the world a little better, trying to do my bit, and having, she called it courage to do it. I call it just sheer pigheadedness.
Well, philanthropy is very close to your heart. And the next day after that article was published, Vogue ran an article on jewelry that you had designed, but for philanthropic causes. And how did that come about? How did you feel doing that? And
Yes.
what did that mean?
Well, some lawyers garden for a hobby. Others have children. I designed some jewelry. So I went to see my jeweler, and she said to me, Tai, I'm doing this collection to raise funds for the Dementia Society in Singapore. I need a men's collection to accompany the women's collection that I've done. I don't know how to do men's jewelry. Can you help? So I said, I'm not sure I can, but I'm willing to try. And she said, so I said, what's the theme? And she said, hearts, arrows and hearts. And I said, no, that won't do. I cannot do a men's collection that says arrows and hearts. I'm going to do nails and souls. And it's all centered around these bad scientific experiments from the 1900s that weighed the human soul at 21 grams. And ironically, the patients who were weighed before and after death were dementia patients.
Oh, wow.
And so that's the connection too. So this piece, which I'm wearing right now, is one of them. It's a bracelet with a tourmaline in the center. Tourmaline is, of course, the October birthstone. It's 2.1 carats. And the bracelet is 2 nails piercing the tourmaline, weighing exactly 21 grams. So it's a soul nailed to a soul. There is a ring that is a 2.1 carat diamond with one inclusion, because no soul is perfect, set into 21 grams, into the ring that's 21 grams that covers the diamond entirely. You can unscrew it and reveal it, but it is covered. A soul encased in a soul. And then there are 1 or 2 other pieces. And I really did it. I'm a terrible lawyer to myself. I have no contract, didn't retain any IP, gave her the designs, have no royalties. But it was fun for me, and I enjoyed doing it. And while it had always been an aspiration of mine to appear in Forbes, it never occurred to me. Right, exactly. And by the way, 8 of these have already sold, so that makes me legitimately a men's jewelry designer.
That's a good. So you know Jake Sullivan, the US National Security Advisor, well from your time together at Yale. He devised a plan on how to deal maybe collectively with Russia, Iran, and China. But what really happened there? What went right? What went wrong? What's your view on that?
So this is an example of how at Yale you have these incredible networks, and I'm literally bottom of the class because Jake Sullivan was at Yale when I was there. My classmate Stephen Hill is the general counsel of NATO. Several ambassadors are there, and law professors. And at Yale, if you're a practicing lawyer, you're sort of the grubbiest of the lot. I am not a government official. I have no access to government secrets, so everything I say is supposition in this regard. It is well known that the United States military can fight 2 wars, not 3. Or we can do one national disaster in 1 war, but we can't do more than that at any one time. The United States has 3 declared enemies: Russia, Iran, and China. We literally cannot fight all 3 at the same time at war. I think Ukraine was a strategy to get rid of Russia as one of the 3. If we wanted the war to end quickly, we could have just flooded Ukraine with munitions and armaments, which would have ended the war. We didn't. We drip feed it, drip, drip, drip. The net result of which is that Russia is now shown to be totally weak and decapitated, getting rid of one enemy. By the way, it also got rid of all our old munitions that we don't want anymore, and now we can fire up the military-industrial complex to make the more sophisticated weapons to replace it. And USAID will give funds to Ukraine, which will then be sent back as contracts to US companies to rebuild Ukraine. So there's an economic aspect to that as well. So having gotten rid of Russia, you're left with Iran and China. There was a peace treaty being negotiated between Saudi Arabia and Israel, which I'm told, through gossip, no state secrets, was 2 provisions away from being concluded. And all the diplomats in the region were convinced the deal was done. Now, I happen to believe that one of the provisions that remained a sticking point is a red line, and that was harder to overcome. But 1 provision away is pretty darn close. Iran couldn't have that, obviously, because Iran is Shia and the rest of the world is Sunni. And so they provoked Hamas to do what it did. Some people think Hamas went beyond what Iran wanted to try and scuttle this peace plan. And in fact, had Bibi Netanyahu responded proportionally to what had happened, I'm told that several Gulf states would have been willing to continue to push forward with the peace plan and point to precisely this incident as proof that you need a peace plan. Well, we are where we are. People have different views on the proportionality and extent of it, but leaving normative judgments aside, it has prevented any possibility of an immediate peace plan. So ironically, if this hypothesis is correct, then Jake Sullivan, who I openly admit is smarter than me, has been outsmarted by the Greek gods, because his plan to get rid of 2 countries, leaving only China to deal with, has left him in exactly the conundrum that we're trying to avoid, because we're in 2 wars and don't have the capacity to fight a third in the Pacific theater. This concerns me greatly, because if you were a country looking to reclaim a province, and the United States is otherwise at capacity in other parts of the world, that provides a perfect window. And I decided at that time that while no one can stop 2 countries from wanting to go to war, we can at least try to prevent them from accidentally going to war. We needed a red phone between China and the US, just like in the Cold War, we had a red phone between Russia and the Soviet Union and the United States. So I lobbied certain heads of states, whom I thought would be trusted by both sides, to please serve as the red phone. Practice note, if you ever lobby heads of states to do something in foreign policy, the next thing that happens is you get investigated to make sure you're not a foreign agent. I'm not a foreign agent, I'm fine, I'm still here. Steve Schwartzman, by the way, I learned, had the same idea as I did, except he didn't lobby states leaders. He offered himself as the red phone.
Very interesting.
Told to me by the head of one of the colleges at Oxford. And so I'm, however, now far calmer about this, because I was terrified the Pacific theater would open, and that literally then is a world war, right? You've got the European theater, the Pacific theater, and the Middle East theater. Jake Sullivan's visit to China recently, I infer to be a conversation about let's both not go crazy. There may be incendiary things we have to say about each other, especially in the run up to the US election. Please don't take it personally. It's just the elections. Um, and and it bodes well that people are talking again at high levels. I don't have no idea what was discussed. I'm just sort of, I have an imaginative mind. I make things up.
It's a moment to just take a few questions, Tai, from the audience, if that works for you.
I had one, if I may. Actually, I had several. I so much enjoyed your talk. It was wonderful. Thank you so much. And I'd love to debate all the ins and outs of international dispute resolution. But I was going to ask you a very different question. I sense from what you're saying that you value the importance of legal education.
Yes.
Well, let us suppose that we were to invite you to Cambridge and ask you to stand up in front of our first year law students. So the first minute of the first hour on the first day of their legal career. What would you say to them? What advice would you give to them about the years they have ahead as lawyers in training?
Well, as a preface to my answer, I'm going to cheat a little bit because I used to be a law professor teaching first years on the first day, in the first minute. I resigned my tenure the year after I got it because I felt I had nothing more to say for free. I would say to them, don't worry about all the technical legal skills that you need as a lawyer. You can learn that on your own. Go buy a horn book. Use this as a time to stretch your mind and to think about what the world could look like and how you can help shape the world to what you think it should look like. Imagine the world to be different. And what's your role in that? This is why, by the way, many of my students hated me. They also hated me because I began contract law with the Roman law of contracts.
Do you have any other questions? So how you had a couple from online. Mario.
And thank you very much for the fascinating, both legal, geopolitical, economic overview. What do you do when the norms of international law have been breached? Now, I'm thinking in particular about Russia, Ukraine. How do you, where do you go from here? How do you sit down? And how do you manage to say, do you know what, we're going to reinstate that law. We're going to reinstate these wonderful articles, these wonderful treaties. Where do you go from there?
Well, actually, in many ways, international law and domestic law are totally different in complexion and character. I sort of think of them as international law is to domestic law as sea elephants are to elephants. But there is, at a different level, similarity in that in both systems of law, you're not compelled to abide by the law. You can choose to break it. There are just consequences. Domestically, the consequences tend to be more certain, and in some cases, more punitive. In international law, there are consequences as well, but of a lesser degree of certainty. And that's why I think of law as a process, because when a law has been breached, it doesn't mean the law doesn't exist anymore. What happens next is crucial, which is the breaching party has to be held accountable. And it may not be in a formal court of law, but the legal argument that it breached certainly plays into justifying normatively actions that are taken against the country, whether it's sanctions, like we've done, or supplying arms, like we've done. And it is to be determined what the final outcome will be. I was talking to the Secretary General of a arbitral institution this year, and we were discussing this idea of the awards not being enforceable, which is analogous to the concern I think you raised. And he said, Tai, but you got this wrong. you can't look at this on a 1-year time frame. If you give it 10 years, you'll find by and large that the awards are largely followed. And he's correct. And so it's a question of time frame. We are used in domestic systems to relatively quick adjudication and finality, and we're done. The nature of diplomacy is slow. And arguably, it's a good thing that it's slow, because if you're still discussing, then you're not going to war.
Thank you, Tai. Great. Yeah, wonderful.
If you woke up and were a young adult again,
I'm still a young adult.
would you change anything? And if so, what?
I wouldn't change a thing. I have reached a point in my life where I recognize that every trial and tribulation, while painful and traumatic and so on, has made me to who I am today. It's given me the character I have, good or bad. And every success has carried with it, if I'm not careful, things that are less attractive: hubris, complacency, narcissism. And so I don't think of things as things to change or good or bad. I just think of things as past facts and how they've shaped me to who I am today. There's a wonderful Joni Mitchell song, by the way, which says, it's called Both Sides Now. And she says, I've looked at life from both sides now. I burst into tears when she sung it at the Grammys this year.
Yeah.
So did Meryl Streep, so I'm in good company.
Yeah, sure. Tai, you kindly invited us last year. You're chairing St. James's Church with the Duke of Edinburgh.
Yes.
It's a very, very big fundraising effort. Can you tell us a little bit about it and how it's going and the far-reaching effects of it?
Yes. Well, so St. James's Church is let me start by saying, even though I'm president of American Friends or chair of American Friends, I'm not Christian. And when they asked me to take this on, I naturally had the thought, why? And then I finally concluded after some months, just as one does not have to be gay to support gay rights, I don't have to be Christian to support a church whose values I admire. And they have a 400-year tradition of social justice. And what the church is doing now, in addition to restoring the very important building by Sir Christopher Wren, is they're building within it a Changemaker program, where they just announced last night, actually, at Windsor Castle, 5 youths from 5 different fields: science, arts, business, and 2 others, I don't know which, will be brought together and given classes to help them, think deep thoughts. And then they will have a 6-month internship with various corporations and so on to give them a boost in life. And the idea is, if you do this with enough people who are talented and motivated with the right values, over time, you'll have a critical mass of people who, in the rightness of time, will be driving change. And so I'm quite drawn to the idea that while restoring old buildings is challenging and important, as you have done here, Anna, it's the programs within it, as you have done here, that make it so valuable.
Well, it's a wonderful initiative, and I know you've been very engaged with it, both in the US and the UK, and thank you very much for doing that.
Okay.
As Churchill said on democracy, it's not perfect, but it's the best that we've got. And I think the same goes for international law, where we are at this moment in time. So I just wanted to say thank you to everybody for joining us this evening. We really appreciate everybody taking the time. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you. Thank you, Chad.